China is in a very difficult situation and things will get much worse. Then we're dealing with the war. Right now, I think all the sides recognize that we're on the brink of war. War is a very dangerous thing, and that would have giant implications for economies. And so you see that we have moved from what was largely unipolar world and a cooperative, globalized world into now this world of great conflict. And so the question now is sort of which side is going to win? And then there are these rounds that we're encountering. And in this round, this one's doing well. And in that round, they're down. And we're looking at it like a football match or a competition. And so before I get into the particulars of China, and there's the particulars of the United States, and there's the particulars of the world, before we get into that, I think that, yes, I think it is clear that the basic picture, that this is going to happen, and that the sides are now lining up for a conflict that I laid out in the book. I think that that's happening. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to be able to pick the winner or the loser, and I don't even know necessarily what that conflict is going to look like. I have thoughts about that, and I'll be happy to share that. But recognize that. That's the important thing. So as this is coming up and we deal with this conflict that's arising, then we're dealing with the war. We will get into what are the problems of China, what are the problems of the United States, but we're not going to know who the winner of that war is for a very, 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 very long time. The fact that we are coming into the war and that we are at the brink of that war and that geopolitical thing operating is the big thing. Now you see how the sides are lining up, like Allied and Axis powers in World War II. You see the same dynamic. How does Europe play into this? Europe doesn't want to get involved in Asia. And then how does NATO and Russia, and then Russia and China, and how they're lining up? And then what does that mean in terms of deglobalization? So recognize the patterns of history, such as, okay, sanctions always took place. You have economic war sanctions, and then the economic war. In World War II, before World War II, it was the sanctions, the United States cutting off oil, embargoing oil, very similar to the United States embargoing or cutting off chips to China, and then freezing of assets. That led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So I think as we get into what's going on in China, let me also deal with the issues of the conflict. There are, between the United States and China, are issues that are red line, irreconcilable differences. They're very risky. They're related to Taiwan. They're related to China's dealing with Russia. How do they provide support, and is that okay, and whatever. They're related to capital movement. It is, of course, correct that as there's this almost impending war and preparation for the war, that American companies or foreign companies want to leave. And in fact, Chinese companies consider, okay, my door is going to close. Can I get out? What does it mean to be global? And so you see the Taiwan issue, you see the support of Russia issue, you see the whole geopolitical issue emerging. And so I want to emphasize that the most important thing is watch these irreconcilable differences. This is also happening in our political year. In the elections, you will see in Congress and you will see in the elections and so on, a much more, let's say, macho or hawkish policies related to China coming together. So I just want to emphasize, before we get into the problems and the issues within China, to recognize that this force is definitely coming together. The sides are aligning. We can get into the question of what does BRICS mean? What does the G20 mean? What does the G7 mean? What does it mean? How does the order work? Well, it'll be disorderly. I wrote a piece that there were, the major issues in China. Some people think that I'm, a China lover. Well, I do say I do love the Chinese culture. I've many friends in China over a particularly long period of time. My job is to look at things objectively. And I'm saying, okay, so yes, let's describe what that looks like. And I've mentioned these problems that they have. First, they have the debt problem. It's a classic debt problem, like written in the book, like the things we talked about the debt. They have to do a beautiful deleveraging. In my opinion, they let it go about 2 years too long, that the debt problem didn't have a restructuring. And so, one man's debts are another man's assets. and as it passes through the system, so that the real estate, which accounted for, 70% of all savings and about 25% of the economy, passes through the system. And also local governments were borrowing money and having money that became unsustainable. That has passed through. Big debt restructurings are very much political issues, because when the decisions are made as a result of how they're made, what are the haircuts? Who receives what? There are big impacts on wealth. So there's a big political issue associated with a debt restructuring. A beautiful deleveraging is still a pretty ugly thing. It's a very difficult thing. It's just done well. But anyway, that went on too long. And then, of course, we have the issue of the geopolitical, the world issue. In other words, the question is, which government will cause problems for investors? Or as we move toward an increased likelihood of war, and people are aware that if you're going to have a war, it's not going to be good to have your assets in that country that's having a war, particularly, let's say if you're an American owning assets in China in that kind of an environment, that becomes a very risky thing. And then, of course, then that war dynamic means that there's a reallocation of resources to produce things at home and to make things, safer. And as a result, that has its implications. So China, yes, China is in a very difficult situation, and the geopolitical issues are important, and the capital issues are important. I think the real question in all of this is, are we going to have war, or are we going to have an intense competition? And right now, I think all the sides recognize that we're on the brink of war. War is a very dangerous thing, and that war can take the form of much more severe sanctions, let's say, economic sanctions and pain, and that would have giant implications for economies because of how they're intertwined. The economies are intertwined. It'll be very inflationary. It'll be very inefficient in terms of the productions. And so we're right now at the edge of that. Neither side wants things to get worse, but I think both sides would say that there's significant risk, that we're right at the edge of that brink. So yes, there are problems in China along those lines. There's a much more autocratic government, which, by the way, is what the classic pattern is. If you look at wars and such periods, which Xi, by the way, described, to summarize his view, is that there's the 100-year storm on the horizon. And if you look at periods of great storms on the horizon, or great storms when they encounter the great storms, that's the threat of collective decision-making. And so there becomes a much more autocratic governments, even in the United States during World War II. And of course, in other countries, you have to follow the rules and you will be severely punished, and it becomes much more autocratic. So there is that dynamic that also is counterproductive because it inhibits the flexibility of their economy. People are afraid to make decisions because it's a risky kind of environment. So that's what's going on in China, and that's in the context of, what's going on in the world and the relationships between them. The two main reasons: it is a very arduous, difficult politically thing to do because it allocates wealth, but they'll have to do it. And second is that after it, they still have to have a plan for those who are living on the debt. What happens with them? So, for example, the local governments. The local governments made their money by a combination of borrowing and selling off land for real estate purposes and so on. Okay, that's where the vast majority of people are. We think of China, we think of Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and so on. But there's all of those provinces out there, economically and financially dependent on that form of borrowing, and things will get much worse. So the issue is, as they're wrestling with that, is how to deal with that. We now have just a new government. In other words, most everybody was replaced in March. And so the taking on that job and dealing with it is a big job. They will have to do it, in my opinion, but those are the big impediments. It's a difficult and threatening thing. I should say that the Chinese have an excellent understanding of the cycles because their view of history started really before 212 BC. The 212 BC was when China was united under the Qin dynasty, but even go. And so they see these cycles. There's internal conflict about what to do. A lot of populism, in a sense, exists in China as it does in the United States. And there's that conflict. Then it leads to more autocratic, and it leads down this path. It's almost mechanical as one thing leads to another. This is a challenging thing for a new administration. It's going to be a very difficult thing. There's a sense in the United States that they are a growing threat. We're close. If we go to a military war, it'll almost certainly be the Taiwan issue. So that could be called containment. I think we want to contain China. Their concerns are mostly the domestic concerns. How do they deal with the demographics issue? How do they deal with their own domestic issues? You know, when you run a country, the major issues are the internal issues. How do you make sure you deal with corruption? How do you deal with all the issues that they face? Poverty in the western part of China, environmental issues, property bubble that's bursting. China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars, and they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war.